Did you know that Abraham remarried at the age of 140? Why does almost no one talk about this wife, and what does the Bible reveal about her? In this video, we explore the mystery of Abraham's forgotten wife, a surprising detail that changes what you thought you knew about his life and biblical history. Do you think you already know the whole story of Abraham, or only the part that is always told? Because when we take a closer look at his entire life, we discover that the Abraham we usually remember is only one part of a much more complex, active, and surprising figure, even in his old age. When Abraham is mentioned, most people immediately think of God's calling, the departure from Ur, the promise of a great nation, and the birth of Isaac. But almost no one talks about what happened afterward, as if his story ended there. However, the Bible does not present Abraham as a man who passively retires after fulfilling his main mission. On the contrary, he continues making decisions, forming alliances, and fulfilling a purpose even at an age we would consider impossible today. According to the biblical account, Abraham lived 175 years. This means that after Sarah's death, he still had several decades of life ahead of him. Active decades, not symbolic ones. This detail is crucial because it breaks the modern idea that old age in antiquity meant inactivity or irrelevance. In the biblical world, longevity was directly associated with blessing, purpose, and continuity. Abraham is not portrayed as a frail, retired old man, but as a strong, respected patriarch fully aware of his role. Even earlier, when he was over 90 years old, he was still leading, negotiating, traveling, and making strategic decisions. Age is never presented as an obstacle for him, but as part of the plan. Here it is important to understand the cultural context. In the ancient Near East, patriarchs did not stop fulfilling their role simply because time passed. Their authority increased with age. A man like Abraham, with wealth, servants, livestock, and an impeccable reputation, was a central figure in his community regardless of his age. His word carried weight, and his decisions affected future generations. That is why it is so striking that the biblical narrative tends to summarize his life into just a few key episodes. Not because the rest is unimportant, but because the theological focus centers on the messianic promise that passes through Isaac. Everything not directly related to that line tends to receive less attention, even if it is not irrelevant. Abraham is called the father of many nations, not just the father of Isaac. This phrase, often interpreted symbolically, also has a literal dimension. His descendants are not limited to a single son or a single people. From this perspective, the final stage of his life takes on new meaning. It is not an epilogue, but an expansion of the original promise. Another detail often overlooked is Abraham's physical and mental condition in his old age. The Bible makes it clear that although he was elderly, he retained the ability to have children. This is not presented as a coincidence, but as part of an extraordinary vitality granted to him. This prepares the ground for understanding why a new marriage at an advanced age would not have been seen as absurd in the biblical context. Moreover, Abraham does not act impulsively. Every important decision in his life has a clear purpose. When he sends for a wife for Isaac, he does so with extreme care, ensuring that the promise continues along the right path. This shows that his mind was lucid, strategic, and fully focused on the future of his lineage. So when the text later mentions that Abraham marries again, this is not an anecdotal detail nor an act of desperate loneliness. It is a conscious decision made by a patriarch who fully understands his role in history. A man who knows his life still has purpose and that his descendants have not yet finished expanding. Understanding who Abraham was at this stage of his life is essential to understanding why the existence of a wife after Sarah is not a contradiction, but a logical consequence. The problem is not that Abraham remarried, but that almost no one pays attention to this part of the story. And it is precisely this neglect that has kept this story in the shadows for centuries. Because when we only look at Abraham as the patriarch of the beginning, we miss the Abraham of the end. The man who, even at 140 years old, was still writing important chapters of a story that continues to influence the world today. What happens when Sarah dies, and why is the silence in the Bible so unsettling? Because after the death of Abraham's most well-known wife, the narrative seems to lower its volume, as if something important were happening between the lines and almost no one stopped to listen. The Bible describes Sarah's death in considerable detail. We are told where she died, how old she was, and how Abraham reacted to her loss. We see him weep, mourn, and then negotiate with the Hittites to buy a burial place. This episode is not minor. It is the first time Abraham legally owns a portion of the Promised Land. Even in death, Sarah remains central to the fulfillment of the promise. But immediately after this highly meaningful moment, the text changes pace. There are no more long speeches or emotional scenes. The narrative becomes restrained, almost dry. Sarah disappears from the story, and with her, a part of the story many assume has ended. As if the implicit message were, this is where what matters ends. However, that silence is not empty. It is a silence filled with intention. Because although the text no longer mentions Sarah, Abraham is still there, alive, active, and with decades ahead of him. And the first thing he does after burying her is not to withdraw from the world or resign himself to loneliness, but to ensure that the future continues. He sends his servant to find a wife for Isaac. This detail is crucial. The fact that Abraham focuses on Isaac's marriage immediately after Sarah's death tells us a great deal about his mindset. He is not paralyzed by grief. He is focused on continuity. In the ancient world, ensuring descendants was not only a family matter, but a spiritual and social responsibility. Isaac had to marry so that the promise could keep moving forward. This is where the silence becomes even more interesting. The text devotes an entire chapter to finding a wife for Isaac, but almost nothing to Abraham's personal life after Sarah. We know what he does for his son, but not what happens to him as a widower. We are not told how he experiences grief or reorganizes his daily life. It is simply assumed that he moves on. This kind of silence is common in the Bible, but not due to neglect. The biblical narrative is not a modern biography that describes inner emotions. It is a selective text that focuses on what it considers essential to the overall message. And here a key question arises. If the Bible chooses not to talk much about this stage, is it because nothing happened, or because what happened was not the main focus? Many readers, finding no explicit details, assume that Abraham remained a widower for the rest of his life. But that idea does not come from the text, it comes from a modern assumption. In reality, the biblical account never says Abraham did not remarry. It simply does not mention it immediately. This silence has had consequences. It has caused generations of readers to see Abraham as a figure almost frozen in time after Sarah, as if his emotional, family, and personal life had stopped. But that does not fit the overall image the Bible gives us of him. An active, strategic man, conscious of his purpose until the very end. Moreover, in the cultural context of the time, it would actually have been strange for a widowed patriarch not to remarry. Marriage was not just companionship, it was structure, alliance, and continuity. Especially for someone with servants, property, and responsibilities, remarrying was a practical and expected decision. The silence, then, denies nothing. It simply delays the information. And when the text later mentions that Abraham had another wife, many are surprised, not because it is incoherent, but because they were not prepared to read that part of the story. This transitional moment, right after Sarah's death, functions as a narrative threshold. It marks the end of an iconic stage, but not the end of Abraham's life. It is the space where the story pulls back, gathers momentum, and prepares to reveal something almost no one remembers. Understanding this silence is essential, because it is not a void, but a pause. A pause that hides a simple yet powerful truth. Abraham's story did not end with Sarah. And everything that comes afterward can only be understood if we accept that the Bible sometimes speaks just as powerfully through what it leaves unsaid as through what it writes. Who was the wife of Abraham that almost no one talks about, and why did her name go unnoticed for centuries? Here we enter one of the most surprising and least known parts of biblical history. Because when the text finally breaks the silence, it does so briefly, almost discreetly, as if it did not want to draw too much attention, but what it says is far too important to ignore. The Bible reveals the name of this wife in Genesis 25, without dramatic introductions or lengthy explanations. It simply says that Abraham took another wife, and her name was Keturah. Just like that. There is no prior genealogy, no courtship story, no emotional context. And it is precisely this restraint that has caused many readers to overlook this detail as if it were secondary. But it is not. Keturah appears in the text after Sarah's death and after Isaac's marriage. This already tells us something important. Her role does not interfere with the main line of the promise, which passes through Isaac. The biblical narrative makes it clear that the legitimate heir is already established. That is why it can mention Keturah without fear of theological confusion. The central plan is secure. Now here a key question arises, one that has generated debate for centuries. Was Keturah really a wife, or was she a concubine? Some translations and commentaries call her a concubine, while the Hebrew text uses a word that can be interpreted as a secondary wife. This ambiguity is not accidental and reflects a cultural reality of the time. In the ancient Near East, the distinction between wife and concubine was not always as clear as we understand it today. Both were part of the household, both could bear children, but the status of those children depended on specific legal and family decisions. In Abraham's case, the Bible later makes this clear: Isaac is the heir. Keturah's sons receive gifts and are sent away, avoiding any conflict. This detail is essential to understanding why Keturah remained in the background. Not because she was unimportant, but because her role was not to continue the messianic promise, but to expand Abraham's descendants in other directions. Remember that Abraham was called the father of many nations, not just one. And this is where Keturah's figure takes on new meaning. Through her, Abraham has several sons, whose names are explicitly mentioned in the text. These sons do not disappear into anonymity. They become ancestors of peoples and tribes that later appear in biblical history, sometimes as allies, sometimes as enemies, but always as part of the same genealogical tree. So why does almost no one remember Keturah? Because the biblical narrative is selective. Its focus is not to tell all stories with the same level of detail, but to guide the reader toward a specific purpose. In this case, the focus is on Isaac and later Jacob. Everything not directly connected to that line receives less attention, even if it is not irrelevant. There is also a psychological and cultural factor. Sarah occupies an iconic place. She is the barren wife who gives birth by divine promise, the foundational matriarch, the figure who embodies impossibility overcome by God. Compared to her, any other woman in Abraham's life seems secondary. But that does not mean she was secondary in reality. She simply fulfills a different function within the narrative. Another interesting point is the timing of Keturah's mention. The text does not say Abraham married her immediately after Sarah's death. It only mentions her when summarizing the final years of his life. This suggests that the marriage may have occurred later, when Abraham was around 140 years old. That is, it was not an impulsive decision driven solely by grief, but part of a mature and conscious stage of his life. This breaks many modern ideas about old age. Abraham is not presented as a resigned old man, but as someone who continues forming a family, making decisions, and actively participating in the fulfillment of his calling. Keturah does not appear as a replacement for Sarah, but as a companion in the final stage of his life. It is also significant that the Bible does not attribute conflicts to this marriage. Unlike what happened with Hagar and Sarah, here there are no tensions, jealousy, or family drama. Everything is presented in an orderly way. This reinforces the idea that this marriage takes place in a different context, with clearly defined roles and without jeopardizing the main promise. From a historical point of view, Keturah helps us understand the origin of several desert peoples and regions neighboring Israel. Her descendants explain relationships, conflicts, and alliances that appear centuries later. Ignoring her means losing an important piece of the biblical puzzle. And from a narrative point of view, her figure reminds us of something essential. The Bible does not always highlight characters by how much text they receive, but by the impact they have on the story. Keturah appears briefly, but her presence expands the promise made to Abraham and shows that his life did not stop after Sarah. Ultimately, Keturah is the wife no one remembers not because she was insignificant, but because her story did not fit the narrative most people were looking for. But when we look closely, she is revealed as a key piece for understanding Abraham not only as the patriarch of Israel, but as the father of many nations. Why would a man of 140 years decide to remarry when, for many, his story should already have ended? This question completely breaks our modern understanding of old age and forces us into the mindset of the biblical world, where age did not mean retirement, but culmination. To begin with, one thing must be made clear: Abraham was not a passive or weakened old man. The Bible presents him, even in his final years, as a fully active man, with mental clarity, social authority, and extraordinary vitality. Remember that Isaac was born when Abraham was 100 years old, and the text makes it clear that his ability to father children did not disappear after that. In fact, His longevity and fertility are presented as part of the divine blessing. Before continuing, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more content like this. That way you'll always be up to date with our upcoming videos. Now, let's continue. From this perspective, marrying at 140 was not absurd, but consistent with his reality. Abraham did not see himself as someone at the end of the road, but as someone who still had a role to fulfill. In the ancient world, as long as a patriarch lived, his function continued. There was no concept of retirement as we understand it today. Another fundamental factor is the cultural context. In the ancient Near East, marriage was not only a romantic or emotional matter. It was a key institution for household stability, asset management, and lineage continuity. A patriarch with possessions, servants, and responsibilities needed a solid family structure. Remarrying was a practical, expected, and often necessary decision. In addition, marriage was directly linked to descendants. Abraham had received a clear promise. He would be the father of many nations. Isaac was the heir of the central promise, yes, but that did not exhaust the scope of what God had told him. Remarrying and having more children did not contradict the promise, it expanded it. Through this new marriage, Abraham's descendants diversified and spread to other peoples. This is where many modern readings fall short. We tend to think everything revolves exclusively around Isaac, but the biblical text itself shows that the story is broader. Abraham was not called only to be the father of Israel, but a foundational figure for multiple nations. His second marriage fits perfectly with that mission. There is also a human aspect that should not be ignored. Abraham had shared decades of life with Sarah. They had traveled together, faced crises, waited for promises, and built a shared story. Sarah's death did not eliminate the need for companionship, family structure, and mutual support. In the culture of the time, prolonged loneliness was not seen as virtuous, especially for a patriarch. However, it is important to note that this marriage occurs after Isaac is already married. This is not a minor detail. Abraham first ensures that the main line is established and protected. Only after fulfilling that responsibility does he make decisions for his own life. This shows that he does not act impulsively, but with a very clear order of priorities. Another key element is the historical moment of the narrative. In Genesis 25, when this marriage is mentioned, the text adopts a closing tone. It is a recap of the final years of Abraham's life. This has led many readers to think everything happened almost immediately, but in reality, a considerable amount of time may have passed between events. The marriage to Keturah was not a sudden act after Sarah's death, but part of a new stage. This detail completely changes the reading. Abraham is not reacting from grief, but acting from stability. He is not trying to replace Sarah or fill an immediate emotional void. He simply continues living, exercising his role, and developing the promise that defined his entire existence. Furthermore, the biblical text does not present this marriage as problematic. There are no conflicts, no family tensions, no corrective divine intervention as in other episodes. Everything unfolds in an orderly, almost administrative way. This reinforces the idea that it was a legitimate, accepted, and coherent decision within the overall plan. From a narrative point of view, this marriage also fulfills an important function. It shows that Abraham's blessing did not end with Isaac. His life is not defined by a single event, but by constant faithfulness that bears fruit until the end. Even in his old age, Abraham remains a channel of multiplication. And here there is a powerful reflection. The Bible does not present Abraham as someone whose usefulness ended after fulfilling a specific promise. It presents him as someone who remains active as long as he has life. This directly challenges our idea of purpose being tied only to youth or early productivity. Marrying at 140, then, is not a strange or anecdotal detail. It is a statement. A quiet but powerful way of saying that, in the biblical narrative, as long as there is life, there is purpose. And that Abraham's story does not fade with Sarah's death, but expands, diversifies, and leaves traces that reach far beyond what we usually remember. This decision, far from being irrelevant, prepares us to understand something even greater, that the children born from this marriage are not a forgotten appendix, but an essential part of the promise that made Abraham the father of many nations. What happened to the children Abraham had with his forgotten wife, and why are they almost never talked about? This question is key, because here the story stops being personal and becomes geopolitical, historical, and deeply strategic. Keturah's children were not a minor detail or an irrelevant appendix of Abraham's life. They were the silent fulfillment of a huge part of the promise that almost always goes unnoticed. The Bible tells us that Abraham had several children with Keturah. Their names are explicitly mentioned: Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shuah. At first glance, this list may seem like just another genealogy, easy to read and forget. But in the Bible, names are never there by accident. Each of them becomes the origin of peoples and lineages that play important roles later in history. One of the most significant is Midian. From him come the Midianites, a people who appear repeatedly in biblical accounts. Not as a distant or unknown nation, but as a group directly connected to Israel. In fact, centuries later, Moses flees to the land of Midian, marries there, and spends years of his life among the descendants of this son of Abraham. This means that a crucial part of Moses' formation takes place among distant relatives, children of the same patriarch. This detail completely changes the perspective. The peoples that later interact with Israel are not strangers without connection, but branches of the same genealogical tree. They are families separated by strategic decisions, not by divine neglect. Abraham was not only the origin of Israel, but also of the peoples surrounding it. Here a key act comes into play that reveals Abraham's wisdom and intention. The text says that while he was still alive, Abraham gave gifts to Keturah's sons and sent them eastward, away from Isaac. This gesture should not be interpreted as rejection, but as organization. Abraham is preventing future conflict. He is establishing clear boundaries so that the main inheritance is not disputed, without abandoning his other children. In the ancient world, this type of decision was fundamental. History is full of wars between brothers over inheritance rights. Abraham, with decades of experience and vision, anticipates that problem. He acknowledges all his sons, blesses them with resources, and allows them to form their own peoples, but makes it clear that the specific promise passes through Isaac. This balance is remarkable. On one hand, he protects the line of the promise. On the other, he literally fulfills what God had told him, that he would be the father of many nations, not just one. Isaac does not exhaust the promise. He channels it. Keturah's sons expand it. Over time, the descendants of these sons become nomadic tribes, merchants, warriors, and desert peoples. Some maintain peaceful relations with Israel, others enter into conflict. But even in moments of tension, the Bible does not present them as completely foreign. There is an implicit familiarity, a shared history that explains why the relationships are so complex. This helps us understand something important. The Bible does not tell Israel's story in isolation. It places it in the middle of a network of related peoples, with common roots and intertwined destinies. Ignoring Keturah's children means losing an essential part of that context. Moreover, this genealogy reinforces the image of Abraham as a truly universal patriarch. He is not only the father of a chosen people, but the ancestor of multiple nations with different roles. Some inherit the spiritual promise, others gain territorial, political, or cultural influence. All of them, in one way or another, are part of the legacy. So why did these children remain in the background of collective memory? Because the biblical narrative is selective. Its primary focus is the messianic line, not the full biological scope of the descendants. But that does not mean the rest lacks value. It means it fulfills a different function. There is also a practical reason. Keturah's children are not the protagonists of the covenant, but they are essential to the context. They are the backdrop against which Israel's history unfolds. Their peoples explain trade routes, regional conflicts, and strategic alliances that would otherwise seem to appear out of nowhere. And there is something even deeper. The way Abraham treats these children shows a rarely discussed model of leadership and fatherhood. He does not discard them, pit them against each other, or create unnecessary rivalries. He acknowledges them, blesses them, and sends them to fulfill their own destiny, each with their space, their identity, and their future. This final act of Abraham is consistent with his entire life. He was always a man who looked beyond the immediate, who thought in terms of generations, not just moments, who understood that true legacy is not accumulation, but order. When Abraham dies, the text says that he was gathered to his people, full of years. And it is Isaac, together with Ishmael, who buries him. This detail closes the circle. Sons from different women, from different stages of his life, converge at the same point. The patriarch who was father to many peoples leaves this world having fully completed his calling. Thus, Keturah's children are not a footnote. They are proof that the promise made to Abraham was far greater than we usually remember. And understanding their story allows us to see Abraham not only as the father of faith, but as the true origin of an entire world of nations connected by a single name. Why did one wife and several of Abraham's children practically disappear from collective memory if they are directly part of the Bible? This question forces us to look not only at the text, but also at how we read it, how it is taught, and which parts are emphasized, and which are left in the shadows. The main reason this wife was forgotten has nothing to do with her story being unimportant, but with the focus of the biblical narrative. The Bible does not aim to be an exhaustive biography or a complete chronicle of all characters. It is a deeply selective text, built around a central line, the promise that passes through Isaac and later through Jacob and Israel. Everything that does not directly feed that line receives less attention, even if it is not irrelevant. This is where Keturah fades into the background. Not because she was not a legitimate wife or because her children did not matter, but because her role was not connected to the messianic line. In other words, she was not forgotten due to insignificance, but due to narrative focus. Added to this is a very human factor, the strength of Sarah's character. Sarah is not just Abraham's wife. She is the barren woman who conceives by divine promise, the foundational matriarch, the figure who embodies impossibility overcome by God. Her story is so powerful that it eclipses any later relationship. Compared to that miraculous account, Keturah's story seems less dramatic, less extraordinary, and therefore less remembered. Another important reason is how biblical stories are taught. From childhood, most people learn simplified versions: Abraham, Sarah, Isaac. Period. Everything that comes after is often summarized or omitted altogether for reasons of time, pedagogy, or tradition. As a result, entire generations grow up without knowing that Abraham remarried and had more children. There is also a deeply rooted assumption that Abraham's story emotionally ends with Sarah's death. Many readers, without realizing it, assume that his life loses relevance at that point. But that is a modern projection. In the biblical world, life was not divided into emotional chapters, but into continuous purpose. Abraham does not stop being a patriarch when he loses his wife. He remains Abraham. There is also a theological reason. To avoid confusion, the biblical text makes it very clear who the heir of the promise is: Isaac. To reinforce that clarity, everything else is narrated with restraint. Keturah's children are mentioned, but it is immediately clarified that Abraham gives them gifts and sends them away. This avoids disputes, but also contributes to keeping them outside the main focus of the narrative. Over time, this restraint turns into forgetfulness. What is not emphasized stops being taught, and what is not taught is assumed not to exist. There is also a modern cultural factor that strongly influences this. It is difficult for us to imagine a 140-year-old man forming a new family. That image clashes with our perception of old age. As a result, many readers unconsciously overlook the text, as if it did not fit what they expect to find. It is not that the text is not there, it is that we do not look at it carefully. However, when analyzed calmly, the forgetting of this wife reveals more about us than about the Bible. It reveals our tendency to simplify complex stories, to reduce characters to a single moment in their lives, to cling to what is familiar and discard what surprises or challenges us. Keturah's story reminds us that the Bible is full of so-called secondary characters who are not secondary at all. They are pieces that complete the picture, that explain historical connections, neighboring peoples, future conflicts, and family relationships that would otherwise seem arbitrary. And there is something even deeper. This forgetfulness also reveals how we understand purpose. We often think a person has a single central role in life and that everything else is secondary. But Abraham's life shows the opposite. His purpose did not end with Isaac. It expanded. It diversified. It multiplied. The wife no one remembers and the children barely mentioned are proof that the promise made to Abraham was far broader than we usually imagine. Not just one line, but many. Not just one people, but entire nations. So the final question is not why Keturah was forgotten, but what we lose when we ignore these parts of the story. We lose context, depth, and a richer understanding of the biblical text. And above all, we lose the opportunity to see Abraham not as a static figure, but as a man whose story continued growing until the end of his days. What really changes in the way we read the Bible when we discover that Abraham did not have a single story, but many branching out at the same time? This question leads us to the deepest implications of everything we have seen, because Abraham's forgotten wife is not just a curious fact, but a key that expands the meaning of the entire biblical narrative. For centuries, Abraham's story has been told in a linear and simplified way: promise, waiting, Isaac, fulfillment. But when we incorporate Keturah and her children, that line becomes a much broader map. Abraham stops being only the patriarch of Israel and is revealed as the father of multiple peoples, each with its own destiny. This does not contradict biblical theology, it enriches it. The Bible states that Abraham would be the father of many nations. This phrase is often interpreted symbolically or spiritually, but Keturah's story shows that it also has a literal and historical fulfillment. The promise is not limited to a single special lineage, but unfolds in multiple directions at the same time. Isaac is the heir of the covenant, but he does not exhaust the scope of the blessing. This has a key theological implication. God does not work only through a single visible and central line, but also through parallel stories that fulfill different purposes. The fact that the Bible focuses its narrative on Isaac does not mean that Abraham's other children are outside the divine plan. It means they fulfill a different role. From a historical point of view, this revelation helps us better understand the biblical world. Many of the peoples who appear as neighbors, allies, or enemies of Israel do not come out of nowhere. They share common roots. They share an ancestor. That explains why relationships are so complex, so charged with family tension, and so difficult to reduce to simple conflicts between strangers. There is also a deeply human implication. Abraham's life is not defined by a single glorious moment, but by consistent faithfulness over decades. Even in his old age, when many would think his story was already written, Abraham continues living, deciding, and building a future. This challenges our modern idea of purpose being limited by age or by a single achievement. Keturah's story reminds us that there are stages of life that receive less recognition, but that does not mean they lack value. There are quiet, understated decisions that have enormous long-term consequences. Abraham did not need grand speeches or supernatural signs to fulfill this part of his calling. He simply remained faithful to who he was, a man called to multiply life. There is also a lesson in how we read ancient texts. We often stick to what is most familiar and overlook what seems secondary. But the Bible is full of meaning hidden in lists, brief mentions, and narrative silences. The wife no one remembers is an invitation to read more carefully, to not close stories too soon. From a spiritual perspective, this topic expands our understanding of the promise. It shows us that God's plan does not always follow a single narrow path, but can unfold broadly and diversely. One patriarch can be the origin of multiple stories, some central, others peripheral, but all connected. In the end, discovering whom Abraham married at 140 is not just answering a historical question. It is opening a window into a richer and more complex way of understanding the Bible. A way that recognizes that stories do not always revolve around a single character or a single line, but reflect a reality far broader than we usually imagine. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of this story, that even what seems forgotten has something to say. That the less told parts of the biblical narrative can completely change our perspective. And that when we look carefully, we discover that Abraham's story does not end with a fulfilled promise, but expands in multiple directions, leaving traces that still influence how we understand the past, faith, and human purpose today. After exploring this little-known part of Abraham's life, it becomes clear that the Bible always has more layers than we tend to see. The wife almost no one remembers and the children rarely mentioned are not insignificant details, but a key piece for understanding Abraham as he truly was, not only the patriarch of a promise, but the father of many stories, peoples, and destinies. This topic reminds us of something powerful. Sometimes the most revealing truths are not in what is most quoted, but in what goes unnoticed. And when we stop and look carefully, the way we understand the Bible changes completely. Now I want to hear from you. Did you know this part of Abraham's story? Do you think these forgotten accounts change how we understand the biblical promise? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'm reading them. If this video gave you something new, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. That way you won't miss our next videos, where we'll continue exploring the mysteries, silences, and hidden details of the Bible that almost no one tells you about.